Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to SETA DC for our panel on Iranian protest and U.S. policy on Iran. As you have followed last month, I think it was the late December, a type of demonstration started in Iran, which analysts in Washington, D.C. and in different parts of the world described and explained and interpreted in different ways. There was extreme support for the demonstrations from the U.S. administration, and immediately after that we had another deadline about the nuke JCPOA, and since then everybody is speaking and commenting about the U.S. policy on Iran and what is going on in Iran, especially after the Secretary of State Tillerson's remarks yesterday. The Iranian issue become again one of the most significant issues in the context of the Syria policy. So we have today 4 expert panelists who will discuss about these issues. I will just shortly introduce them, and you can find the bios at the back actually. Trita Parsi, on my right, is President of National Iranian American Council. Slavin is the Director of Future of Iran Initiative at Atlantic Council. Vatanka is Senior Fellow at Middle East Institute. And Kadir Ustun is Executive Director at the SETA Foundation here in Washington, D.C. So we will start our panel with Alex, and if you can give us a synopsis or your reading of what happened in Iran in the last weeks of December and the first weeks of January.
Great. Well, thank you, and thanks for the invitation. I'll try and be brief, and I apologize in advance if I have any coughing going on here, suffering from a bit of a cold. But in terms of what happened, you know, it's, I guess, maybe easy in some ways to compare what happened in 2017, end of 2017, with what happened in 2009. And the big difference for me as an Iran watcher is that this was something that didn't start in north of Tehran. You know, the usual cliche in DC is, well, north of Tehran is not really representative of Iran. The rest of the country seems to be fine with Islamic Republic. Well, these latest protests showed, spreading to 80, 90, 100 towns and cities, that there is a lot of anger built up in the society. Now, are these young protesters? And that's another key issue to keep in mind, the differences in demographics here. In 2009, you had a relatively older demographic in the streets than you have this time around. This was a very young set of protesters. By the way, women were not a big part of these protests from everything I've been able to see. And the question is, why were women not so heavily represented in the ranks of the protesters? And a credible explanation for that, I think, is the fact that the protesters were not just only young men oftentimes, but also extremely radical, well, certainly in the context of the Islamic Republic, very radical in their demands. So when it started on the 28th of December in the city of Mashhad, the slogans were, you know, death to Rouhani and death to the government. Relatively speaking, nothing too radical about that, I guess. But within a few days, it had spread from Mashhad to other parts of the country and became one of death to the Islamic Republic, bring this entire system down. Very radical. I just wonder if some of those middle class, upper middle class folks in Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, and other big urban areas, and the women thought this was a bit too much. That doesn't mean just because women were not in the streets that they don't sympathize with the demands of the protesters. I think there's a lot more sympathy for the protesters in Iranian society than your footage from the TV screens might show. There's a silent majority. Clearly there's a silent majority. But let me not talk about the silent majority. Let me quickly wrap up here by talking about what I think for me is the headline. And the headline for me is the people that you witnessed in the streets of Iran over the course of that 10 days from 28th of December till, I guess, around middle of the second week of January. This is a younger generation. This is a generation that oftentimes was born in the early 1990s. No references to the Shah were made. No references to Mir Hossein Mousavi and the Green Revolution or the opposition of 2009 was made. This is, for me, the story. Who will shape this youth, this radical young demographic that's coming up through the pipes in Iran, that oftentimes is educated? Many of the people who were arrested are university graduates. One of the key grievances they had when they came out is, where are the jobs? Where's the money? How does this system take care of me and my family? And if you're a Farsi speaker and you want to sit down and kill a few hours watching YouTube videos, I mean, this in itself makes such a great study. Just listen to them. Tell their stories. Nothing is being done for me. Everything's been done for some ideological project far away in a land called Lebanon or Syria or Iraq or maybe elsewhere. That doesn't do it for me. And that, I think, is the elephant in the room. Because there is that much money that goes around the system. So the challenge for Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, and I think the focus ought to be on him, not Rouhani. Rouhani is elected by 24 million votes. That's a nice round figure. And he should be proud of that. But the fact is, he knows it. He can't call the shots. And this is, I guess, the question for Khamenei. What does he want to do? Khamenei has strangled Iranian reform within the regime. There used to be something called Iranian reformism. There used to be something called a reformist faction in the Iranian parliament that actually mattered, that actually could initiate legislation, could push forward legislation on sensitive topics such as press freedom and so forth, right? That reformist reality in the Iranian parliament is gone, is dead. That's thanks to Khamenei. So he's strangled, taken all the air out from within the regime. This is why you see the radicalization of the opposition. This is why people have kind of given up on the hope of gradual reform within the Islamic Republic. The younger generation certainly don't seem to have the patience of the generations before them, who might have been at the lead in 2009. They're saying, to hell with gradual reform. It's not happening. Gradual reform seems to be one way of fooling us, pretending that things are getting done in a direction of reform, but really nothing substantive is happening. Obviously, this whole political set of grievances are exacerbated by the shortcomings on the economic front. And yeah, sure, we can blame some of that on the sanctions, on what has gone on in Iranian foreign policy, but that's just only one part of it. The big issue is corruption. This country has a massive corruption problem. This is a country where you have oftentimes officials with 30, 40 jobs, official paying jobs, while there are towns that were impacted by these protests with unemployment rate of 60%. These are hard realities that I don't think any number of guns and more security forces will indefinitely be able to control. So the question is, what kind of reform might Ayatollah Khamenei be willing to do or initiate? Because Ayatollah Khamenei will be 79 this year. He has to think about his legacy. Who will come after him? And what sort of situation is he going to leave behind when he leaves? Because he got a very stable situation when he inherited the throne back in 1989. And I think it would be wise for him to start thinking about really some of the fundamental structural problems in the country that cannot just be blamed by pointing the finger at President Trump or somebody outside. These are inherently rooted in Iran's own shortcomings at home since 1979. I'll stop there.
Okay. Just to ask you a question before we move on. Should we expect more demonstrations such as this in the coming months, since you think that it is because of the economic reasons mostly? Yeah,
I think that's a very strong scenario because, again, this started in the last. This last summer with pensioners coming out. People with bank deposits that were at risk of being lost came out. This didn't start with the youth in small towns. This started with big city the pensioner classes, they call them in Farsi. They came out and they still have issues. There are a number of Iranian banks that are at the risk of collapse. Billions of dollars will be wiped out. A lot of that money belongs to ordinary people who thought this was one way for them to save their money. And they're not getting the interest. Not only that, they might even lose their deposits. So as I said, I want to go back to a point I made. There are some inherent structural problems in the Iranian economy that you can close your eyes and say, this is the doing of some foreign entity. It's not. And they know it. And you know why I know they know it, the regime that is? Because they say it in Iranian media. There are hundreds of Iranian outlets that Farsi speakers, and a lot of it's produced in English, can actually read about some of these debates that are going on. The awareness is there. The fact that an official who has another 35, 40 jobs, that just is not how you do it. Those things are recognized as issues that need to be tackled, but it takes political will from the top, political courage from the top, to initiate those serious reforms. I'm not sure if Ayatollah Khamenei has that vision. As I said earlier, I hope he would, because I think as somebody who was born in Iran and certainly would want to see Iran go in the direction of reform without bloodshed, I think that is what, we ought to hope for. But as I said, the youth have given up. The ones who are living inside the country have given up. They hear promises and they don't see the results. But Khamenei's record, if you go back to the protest of 92, the protest of 99, the protest of 2001, the protest of 2009, every time he would play around on the margins, pretend that he had heard the voices of the people, but really all he did was added layers to the security apparatus to crack down, to monitor. And as I said, that's just, it has proven itself to be a short-term solution, not a sustainable solution.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will have more questions in our second round.
Sure.
Barbara, your perspective about the protest and how Rouhani handled the protest, and what would you expect after this, the calm of this, like the calmness that appeared from now?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, SETA, for inviting me. I largely agree with Alex's analysis of the events. Let me just add a couple more points. First, protests are nothing new in Iran. This is a quote-unquote revolutionary regime that demands that people come out for Friday prayers, for the anniversary of the revolution. Every time I've gone to Iran, there's been some sort of government-organized protest of some sort or another. So people are quite used to going in the streets, chanting slogans. Of course, the government does not like it when the slogans are directed against it, but the habit of protest, the habit of demonstrating is something that's really ingrained in most Iranians. Alex pointed out a lot of the demonstrators were quite young, and certainly young people, as we know from our own experience and the experience in many other countries, young people are easier to motivate to go out in the streets. In Iran, people also find this a kind of entertainment. I mean, if there is a victory in a big soccer match, elections, any excuse to go out in public and mingle with your cohort and think you can get away with it, people take it. So I think you should bear that in mind. Another fact, the UCLA sociologist Kevin Harris mentioned recently that in of the towns and cities, maybe about 100 places where there were protests, there have been labor protests in 70 of them. These are people coming out protesting because they haven't gotten back wages. And this is over the past 5 years. Alex mentioned the banking issues, but there are also the problems of state-run organizations that have not paid people. Mm-hmm. So again, a habit of protest in these areas. Because they were scattered, because they were small, because foreign correspondents don't get to go wandering around very easily in Iran, they weren't noticed in the West, but they existed. So we should also keep that in mind. Now, the reaction in Washington when these protests began, of course, was interesting. Those who dislike the policies of the Iranian government, many of them decided that this was 1979 all over again, or 2009 all over again. And they fully expected that the regime would be extremely brutal in cracking down, that this would lead to a wave of protests that would go on and on and on for months, and perhaps the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. Not yet, not so much. The government has learned lessons from 2009. They were very careful in their application of force. There were certainly abuses that occurred. There have been several young people who, quote unquote, committed suicide in jail. I don't think so. But the number of deaths, about 24, several thousand arrested. Most of those people have been let go. The response in terms of rhetoric, Rouhani and even Khamenei to some extent said, you have grievances, we hear you, we understand that you have legitimate grievances. However, you cannot attack public property, you can't resort to violence. In 2009, Ahmadinejad, then the president and the victor in fraudulent elections, called the protesters dust and dirt. And this time, people specifically said, no, this is not dust and dirt. These are Iranian people, and they have legitimate grievances. So they've handled it more astutely. in terms of whether there can be real reforms, I mean, that's the huge question. Some steps are being taken. Rouhani himself leaked the budget that showed exorbitant amounts of money going to clerical institutions, foundations, whatnot, that are very opaque. People don't see the benefits coming back to them in terms of jobs. There was a very good piece on the Al Monitor website yesterday by an economist named Bijan Hajipour on Rouhani trying to introduce performance-based budgeting. This is a transparency measure. He wants those that get the money to say how they used it. And unlike, again, the situation under Ahmadinejad, when Iran was flush with oil revenue, money was just thrown at various schemes, including housing schemes and whatnot, turned out to be, that the money was wasted, the money disappeared in corruption. And so Rouhani knows what he has to do. I think the real question is, can he do what he wants to do? He has a more professional staff, certainly, than Ahmadinejad did. He has real economists, people who understand what is necessary. And the final factor, of course, is the international climate in which all of this is happening. When you have a president of the United States who's actively undermining the Iran nuclear deal, and has been since he came into office, that makes foreign companies hesitant about investing in Iran, creating the jobs that Iran needs. So, it's not the best climate, but there is a lot that Iran can do on its own to get its own house in order. And, this is the time when we will see whether the system, the nizam, as it's called, can step up and begin to change in a way that would satisfy some of these grievances. Final point, you don't have a revolution as long as Tehran is quiet. You need the capital. And the capital was relatively quiet. So until the middle classes, upper middle class, whatever, in North Tehran and others decide that they're going to put their green ribbons on again and go into the streets and chant death to the dictator, you have protests, you have serious grievances, but you don't have another revolution.
Just again, one question. Both you and Alex mentioned the youth as the main mobilizing force in these demonstrations. Who are these youth? So are we talking about under 25, and what is the portion of the society?
Yeah, 17 to 25 years old, most of those arrested. Many of them graduates of branches of universities, Azad University, and whatnot, that have been set up over the years so that they have degrees, but they're not from the best universities, so it's not exactly, a ticket to a great job. Demographically, Iran is not that young a country anymore. The median age, I think, is around 31 or 32. And so when you really saw the most sort of youth ferment was actually in the previous decade, when you saw the young people who came out in support of Khatami in 1997 and students in 1999. You had a much younger youth cohort then. The society is aging. So that is another factor in support of more gradual change rather than some sort of violent and sudden upheaval.
Thank you. And Trita, your perspective and U.S. reaction to these demonstrations.
Sure. Thank you so much. Great pleasure being here at SETA, and thank you for being on this panel with esteemed colleagues. Let me say a couple of things about the protest and then go into the U.S. response as well. I would first say that despite the fact that the protests have died down for now, I think the anger is still there, clearly. It's not been addressed properly. And as a result, there should be expectations that unless something is actually done, this will be recurring. But even then, with that, I think we have to also recognize that this protests actually, to a certain extent, have been successful. They have achieved things. So let me go back and talk a little bit how it started and how it evolved in order to be able to explain why I think it has been successful to a certain extent. By all accounts, and I've spoken to people who were on the ground in the city of Mashhad at the time, the original protest started there, organized by hardline opponents of Rouhani. This was very much driven by the budget that he had introduced, in which in that budget he was starting to do some of the rather radical reforms. I don't know if that's a term you used, Alex, but essentially addressing some of the real sicknesses in the Iranian system by looking into the fact that there's all of these different charities, completely opaque. The conservatives control them. They're eating up a big chunk of that budget, which then feeds corruption, feeds cronyism, also feeds another thing that we haven't talked about, which is that income inequality in Iran has become much, much worse than it was during the time of the Shah. And that was one of the driving factors of the revolution back then. It's worse today than it was in 1979. And so much of this has been able to go through because the budget is so opaque and there's so many secret things in it. And he took a relatively small step of trying to bring light to that because he wants to change it, because he is in a confrontation and a battle, at least in some dimensions, with some of these elements, and particularly with the IRGC. This truly angered hardliners, and they organized a protest in the city of Mashhad, which is, of course, the home of the conservative rival of Rouhani in the elections a couple of months ago. What's so interesting is that they completely miscalculated. They did not recognize that the anger in society over all of this corruption, this lack of jobs and everything else was so strong that it wasn't just their own people that came to that protest, but he actually started attracting a whole set of other people who were not there to protest Rouhani specifically, but they were there to protest the regime as a whole. And rather quickly, they lost control over it. Now, here's what's fascinating. From Rouhani's perspective, it seems like he believes that the hardliners broke a red line. And that red line is that the regime fights inside of itself, in the parliament, within the elite circles, but they don't take their fights against another faction to the streets. That's what they did this time. And they lost control over it, and they gave birth to protests across the country in more than 70 or so cities. So Rouhani seems to think that because that red line is crossed, it's now crossed for him as well. So he is then adopting a position very different from what existed in 2009, as Barbara and others pointed out, in which they were just coming down on the protesters entirely, did not recognize any grievance they have, accused all of them of having been part of a conspiracy, accusing all of them of having been supported by the outside. Instead, you had some people in the regime that was saying, oh, this is, fomented by the outside. And then you had members of parliament, you had members of the Rouhani government itself saying, no, most people are going out there protesting is not because of foreign government, some perhaps, but most are there because they're angry. And they're angry about these different things. And then he started shifting. This is the interesting thing. He said, it's not just the economy, because he knows very well when it comes to the economy, he's vulnerable. He's not been able to do the changes that are needed. Instead, he says they're also angry about the political situation. They're angry about the social situation. Why? Because the conservatives are vulnerable when it comes to the social issues, when they come to the political issues. So what you're seeing here is that as a result of this, the red lines that the regime itself had on how it could fight and compete with each other have started to be broken. And they're now actually trying to channel the anger of society, channel even protests for their own purposes against their rivals. This we did not see before. We didn't see a dialogue of this kind. We didn't have a situation in 2009, for instance, in which plenty of people were being killed in the prisons. The government comes out with its own story about it, and it wasn't being questioned. It is now openly questioned, not just by personalities in the Iranian scene, but by members of parliament who are going out there saying there's no foreign involvement here. Why is some people, why did suddenly 3 young kids commit suicide in jail? We want an investigation. We want to know what's going on here. We don't trust this story. This is very different. So perhaps I would differ a little bit with Alex in the idea of saying that reform is dead. To me, this is actually an interesting development, unfortunately, coming as a result of some of this bloodshed. But it's an interesting development because we didn't see this in 2009. The other thing that is also important, has been pointed out, this is youth, this is primarily outside of Tehran, but it's also elements that have not been as organized before. That's part of the reason why many of us had not paid attention to them, myself included, because they were not organized, they were not at the center of Iran's political development in the last 20 years. But it also means that it was much more difficult for them to be able to sustain it, but also much more difficult for them to be able to reach out to other segments of society who, at the end of the day, are going to be needed. I personally believe that there is a tremendous amount of sympathy in that silent majority for the grievances of the protesters. People I've spoken to who are not out there protesting and nevertheless were very, very sympathetic to the grievances. I did not sense the same degree of sympathy with the methods, not the same degree of sympathy with how this whole thing was coming about, precisely because not everyone has lost faith in the idea of change from within. Not to say that they're particularly enthusiastic about it, not to say that they think that it has an amazing chance of success, but because of the experience of 1979, because of the Arab Spring, in which essentially there's only one country that arguably could be said is better off after the Arab Spring than compared to before, all of these things are considerations that people are having. And it was more than one conversation in which people were saying, look, we want to see change, but we don't want to do it in a way that we would risk becoming Syria, because who would want to become that? So sympathy for the protesters and sympathy for how it's being done is very different. And particularly when you have a leaderless movement, perhaps not even a movement because it's just essentially a lot of anger, it's also easier manipulated. It can easier be lost control over. And these are things that people have been concerned about. But unless the government actually starts addressing the real grievances, it is very difficult, I think, to be able to say that this is going to just die down and that this was just one episode. This is going to continue. But the interesting thing is they have forced the government now to have a dialogue that is much more open than it was before about the many, many problems they have inside. And the overwhelming problems, of course, are on the inside. The cronyism, the income inequality, the corruption, etc., is all from the inside. There is, however, a very important component. This is when I want to shift over to the U.S. side.
Before the U.S. side, can I ask you, so all of these structural problems were present, and last year Iran had this record level of economic growth, right? So educate us, why now the demonstrations?
That's an excellent question, and this is where I think the element of the outside becomes very important. A lot of people, when they went and re-elected Rouhani, 57% in 2009, just a couple of months before these protests, were not voting for him. They were essentially voting against the other person. They were very disappointed with the economic performance. You're right, the economic growth is good on paper. The reason why it's good on paper, but not in the sense that real people feel it, is because it's largely driven by oil sales. As a result of sanctions in the past, the Iranians could not export a lot of oil. The only area where the sanctions relief actually has worked is on oil. So they're selling a lot of oil. But average people don't get oil money. The government gets oil money. Average oil sales don't create jobs. What creates jobs is investments. So people were being patient. They were like, okay, well, the deal is coming. It's going to take a while before it starts happening, etc. And the government probably thought that they had more time than they did. One of the reasons why it happened now is because all of these things coming together, with the budget being released, them challenging this, the fact that, and this is one part in which the U.S. absolutely is involved in, which is that the deliberate uncertainty that Trump has created around the durability of this deal. Every time there's a deadline, we don't know what he's going to do until the very last minute. Mattis doesn't know what he's going to do. Tillerson doesn't know what he's going to do. And I'm not saying that they don't know. I think they actually don't know. But I think it's a deliberate strategy on Trump's end that he doesn't say anything to anyone because he wants this uncertainty. Why? Uncertainty is a de facto sanction.
Yeah.
If you are an investor, you want to go into Iran, you need financing. Financing comes from banks. Banks look at the project, well, it's a 7-year project. But I don't know if this deal is going to survive 4 months. So if you don't know if the deal is going to be there for 4 months from now, why would you sign on to finance a project that is going to take 7 years? You're going to lose your money. So all of them are staying out. The reason why this is important is because the main driver of job creation, mindful of the other problems the Iranians are having, and particularly mindful of the fact that Rouhani has been pursuing an austerity policy in which he tried to bring down the inflation. And I think he brought it down from roughly 40% to 10, 12%. When you bring down inflation, you kick up unemployment. In order to balance that, you need investments. Investments did not come in, partly, and I would say actually mainly when it comes to the investment side, because of the manufactured uncertainty that Trump created about the durability of the deal. All of these things have now come to a head, and you see these protests.
Thank you. Kadir, the regional reactions for this and also the Turkish reaction. We know that President Erdogan had a phone conversation with President Rouhani immediately after the beginning of the demonstrations. So what do you think was Turkey's position about these demonstrations and how about the region, especially the Gulf?
Thank you, Kilic. It's great to be among these Iran experts. I already learned a lot on this panel. And with Barbara a couple months ago, we had a panel discussion at Atlantic, and I was emphasizing one of the primary concerns for Turkey was stability, regional stability. And I think that played a big part in that phone call and the message given to Iran. Trita mentioned that, prospect of becoming another Syria, it's not an immediate reality. I recognize that, but the idea that, Turkey is next door to Iraq and Syria, civil war, instability, threat of terrorism, etc. They didn't want another trouble next door. So their approach to Iranian protests was to sort of support the stable government or send a message of support. But this comes against a background of more than a year of negotiations over Syria within the context of Astana process, and also the Turkish-Iranian agreement on couple of regional issues. We saw that in the Qatar crisis. We saw that in the KRG referendum. We are also seeing that over the PYD issue. So, particularly in the context of Syria, northern Syria, when PYD is being now supported by the US directly, it's being armed, trained, etc., and now Turkey really heightened its rhetoric against this relationship. It wants it to end, be modified at the very least, transform into something else, and calls it an army of terror along its borders, etc. So, and it's being defined. I'm mentioning the PYD. The debate inside Turkey has reached a point where Turkey sees this absolutely existential threat, and that's being supported by a NATO ally, the US. And then we've seen Iran over the past 6 months, a year, perhaps, trying to take advantage of this disconnect between the US and Turkey, and came up with proposals to cooperate against PKK and against PYD. Of course, Iran has its own sort of PKK branch, which is PAJAK. It's not as big of a threat to Iran like it is, like PKK is to Turkey. However, it's still a concern. And then you saw Turkey and Iran agree on this idea of territorial integrity of Iraq and Syria. How, no matter how elusive that might be, it's still a principle. They try to stick to it, and that constitutes the sort of backbone of negotiations. So these overlaps.
Sure, I'm not doing.
Despite all these overlaps and convergence of interests on particular issues, since the beginning of the Syrian civil war, you've seen an adversarial, let's say, if you can define it that way, relationship between Turkey and Iran, especially over the future of the Assad regime. And it became clear to Turkey maybe towards the end of Obama administration that it couldn't work with the US on Syria anymore, with the prospect of sort of regime change. And since 2014 fall, the US support to PYD simply increased over time. And it's been 3.5 years. So what's happening is that in Iraq and Syria, Turkey and Iran are cooperating, and then at the diplomatic level too, not just security level. But this cooperation is not as deep as it might look. There's heightened level of apprehension about Iran's regional role at the same time. So these agreements are not able to wash away the Turkish sort of distrust of Iran, especially when it comes to various regional issues. on that front, when Turkey finds the U.S. rhetoric about confronting Iran, it's a broadly positive idea. Yes, Iran's reach into Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, elsewhere, whatever, it's too much, and it needs to be somehow confronted. But I think the method would be very different, and the U.S. doesn't have a specific proposal how it wants to accomplish that. It does talk about it, but if the route to confronting Iran is conflict and going back to containment strategy against the Iranian regime and with the goal of regime change, I think Turkey won't align with that either. So what is required for Turkey, what's necessary for Turkey, if you want to cooperate with Turkey about confronting Iran in its regional outreach, regional influence, that will have to be a much more sort of sophisticated policy. And I don't think anybody in this room believes that that kind of policy is going to be coming anytime soon. So in the meantime, you're going to see Turkey cooperate on immediate security issues, trying to find diplomatic solution in Syria, continue to do that, but at the same time being sort of suspicious of, let's say, potential for full-blown cooperation with Iran. And I just want to say, we were discussing this earlier, a couple words about the Gulf. The Saudis and the UAE, you saw them trying, as soon as Trump came to power, became president, they saw an opening and then they tried to punish Qatar. And that gambit largely failed. In that instance, you found Turkey and Iran more or less on the same side. And when we looked at the KRG referendum a while back, which became an eventual failure, both Turkey and Iran, to the surprise of many, were actually very close, cooperating on this. Some can define it as sort of anti-Kurdish, sentiment on both sides. I don't think that's the case. I think both powers see an interest in maintaining the territorial integrity and establishing some sort of stability while pushing for their narrow sort of policy goals through their proxies in various countries. And this is, of course, we can talk about the U.S. leadership, the absence of it, and then perhaps U.S. keep getting focused on particular issues and letting those issues define everything else. We see that in the issue of PYD. It was a tactical relationship first. Now it's not sure what they want to do with it. They announced there was going to be a border patrol, small 30,000 army, but Tillerson said, no, that's not going to happen. So there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty, but in the meantime, the regional powers are trying to watch out for their narrow interests, and that brings them together on certain issues, and that's what's happening with Turkey and Iran as well, I think.
Thank you. I have a short question. It will be like second round, but every panelist will have 2 to 3 minutes to answer. If I just follow up with the regional expansion, so in the demonstrations we also see that there were at least some slogans criticizing Iranian policy, Iranian foreign policy in the region, especially its policy in Syria, at least, like in terms of spending money to Syria. Maybe it is not ideological criticism, but in terms of resource allocation at least. So what do you think, what will be the impact of those slogans? We know that it has been before that there was criticism about Iranian influence in Lebanon as well, but do you think it will make any significant influence to Iranian foreign policy?
Well, I think at this point there will be a soul-searching moment going on in the Islamic Republic. I just don't know how far they're going to be searching for that soul of the nation, and if it is a deep soul-searching process, and as I said, I don't know the answer, But if it is, then it certainly would have, you know, an element to it where you will sort of ask the simple question of what are we doing in the region to what end? Because one of the things the Iranians are doing so much of these days is this sort of a, you know, people might disagree with this. It's not just geopolitical advancing Iran's agenda. I mean, you could argue what Iran is doing in Syria is nothing for a tit-for-tat strategy. Saudi Arabia is going to be there, I will be there. Turkey will be there, I will be there. So there's nothing ideological about it. But I think that's not the full picture. There's another side to what Iran is doing, not just in Syria, but also in Iraq, which is to sort of recreate itself outside in the Arab world. I think that's a long-term project. That's an expensive project. You know, when you see Hashd-e-Sha'b in Iraq, when you see those militiamen in Syria forming themselves, running themselves in a mirror image of the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, that's ideological blueprint. That's not just geopolitics. And I think that, if it's not confronted, would basically take the bad model that hasn't delivered in Iran and export it to outside, to the Arab world. But to your point about what the average Iranian protester wants, the average Iranian protester certainly doesn't want to see money they don't have spent elsewhere. And you know, this is not just about the last protest. This is a long history going back to 1979. Why are we supporting the PLO? Why are we supporting Hezbollah when we don't have the money? It might have been an entirely different situation if Iran had endless resources. But Iran doesn't. Iran's economy is shrinking. President Rouhani, I think Trita talked about the subsidy reform that has to be instituted, because that was a horrible policy that Ahmadinejad initiated back in his first term. Some 71 million Iranians are on handout. They get cash handout. Of that 71 million, 33 million have to be kicked off because the state just simply doesn't have the money to pay for it. You would have to have a minimum income of $249 a month or less to qualify for subsidy reform. That sort of structural reform is going to be painful. And just imagine the reaction when Iran has to foot the bill for billions of dollars of reconstruction in Syria. Just imagine how that's going to go down the streets of Tehran and elsewhere. The Iranian regime, and I've actually heard this from many different sources in the region, Islamic Republic would be so much more solid if it focused on the economy at home and cut back. Because even if it doesn't spend that much, because we can debate actually how much Iran spends. How much of what Iran's spending in Iraq is not actually Iranian money, it's Iraqi oil money that the Iranians are controlling through their allies in Iraq. That's an open question. Nobody knows the answer. But it's probably a significant amount of money. But that's not the point if you're an ordinary Iranian. The perception is this regime doesn't represent me. I mean, a majority. I think the Iranian regime on a good day would still have 15-20% support, right? That's my guess when I look at the numbers. But it's still, the majority are saying, you're not accountable. Barbara, you talked about how Rouhani leaked the budget. I mean, just imagine if the corruption scandals that we know there are plenty of came to light. You know, this is one of the things Trump administration could do. Instead of banning Iranians to travel to the United States, they should think of ways of how can we make them get better at getting the information, get to the information, spread the information, because that information is going to be very powerful in mobilizing ordinary Iranians.
For both Barbara and Trita, maybe. So when we look at Washington, we see three waves, I think in the administration as well. So President Trump's tweets and some other think tanks, they're supporting something closer to regime change in Iran. And on the other hand, State Department, Assistant Secretary of State, in his interview, he mentioned human rights, but he was very careful, and he's basically denied any willingness on the US administration about the regime change. On the other hand, we see General Mattis and National Security Strategy document focusing on Iranian regional expansionism, or maybe, you know, a willingness to contain Iran. So do you think in the short term or medium term, can United States integrate these different policies and have a comprehensive Iran strategy?
I personally don't see it. In terms of President Trump's tweets, he doesn't care about human rights, as we know. He loves to cozy up to dictators. The only tweets that have mentioned human rights, I think, since he came to office were in regard to Iran. So it was quite selective. There are a variety of views on Iran within within the administration. And I mean, Mattis, curiously, is perhaps the biggest dove of the lot, because he, even though he's said many harsh things about Iran in the past, he does not want a military confrontation with Iranian forces or militias at a time when the United States has a handful of troops in Syria and a somewhat larger number in Iraq and an even bigger number in Afghanistan, and those troops are all vulnerable to Iranian retaliation. Can I also point out that in a sense, the administration has already achieved some of its purported goals, because Iran hasn't tested a ballistic missile, I think, since
March.
of
January, March.
last year. Yeah. Iran, there have been no incidents in the Persian Gulf, as far as I know, between U.S. Ships and the Revolutionary Guard Navy. Iran's actually been fairly circumspect in some of these areas. So, you know, in terms of, we can talk about its regional posture, but again, apart from Yemen, which was something that the Iranians did specifically to annoy Saudi Arabia, and successfully did, back in, 2015 now, I guess. Iran has always had a strong relationship with the Assad regime since 1980, has been in Lebanon since the 80s. These are not new. In terms of Iraq, the United States, as we know, got rid of Saddam Hussein and opened Iraq to Iranian influence, much more than they had had in the past. So I always, you know, all this talk about confronting Iran, rolling back Iran, you know, so many of these were own goals, so many of these were policy mistakes committed by the United States that the Iranians were able to take advantage of, and any astute country would have taken advantage of. Yemen, we should end that war somehow. We should tell the Saudis no more ammunition, no more logistical support. End this war. This is a humanitarian disaster that should not continue. Qatar, same. I mean, this is ridiculous. So, you know, that's where I would see the United States having some more creative and active diplomacy. One other point, you know, the administration talks about renegotiating or fixing the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And their way of doing this is to talk to the Europeans and threaten the Europeans. No mention of actually talking to Iran about this agreement, about perhaps further incentives that could be given to Iran if it wanted to extend the agreement. I, for the life of me, don't know how you negotiate an arms control agreement with another country without talking to that country. So I'm not impressed. I mean, I think there are elements of a policy out there, bits and pieces, sometimes intelligent remarks made by certain individuals. But if you try to put it together into a coherent whole, I don't think you're there.
Trita?
On your first question, no, I don't see it happening at all. I don't think there's any details I need to. I think Barbara covered it. But let me say a couple of other things. I thought it was interesting what Barbara said, that perhaps Trump has been successful already because there hasn't been any missile tests. Fortunately, there's not been any incidents in the Persian Gulf. It could be that he's been successful. I personally believe that it's because of a completely different reason. I think the Iranians have figured out that if they just keep a low profile, Trump is going to shoot himself 5 times in the foot on a daily basis. Why interfere? Just don't do anything. Let the United States just undermine itself, because that's what this president is really good at. So I think it has more to do with that than that they actually felt deterred or anything else. On the issue of the population being unhappy about how Iran is spending money regionally, it's actually a very interesting question, because we've seen how population attitudes on this has gone up and down. I would say the normal is, yes, the normal state is that the Iranians in general are unhappy about Iran's involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the idea of money going to Hezbollah. And up until recently, there were really no credible numbers on this to begin with. It's just a sense that the money clearly is going there. How much, people don't know. That has definitely been a very steady attitude amongst the population. And the government itself has rarely tried to explain it, except for relying on these ideological explanations, which I don't think is the driving force for what they're doing. But then there's also interesting points in which we see the attitude is changing. University of Maryland has done polls on this, and as well as others. There was a recent poll that came out by Zogby as well, and they had asked this question every year. And Iran's involvement in Syria was ranking 22% approval rating amongst the population in 2015 and 2016. It was much higher. It was actually 70% in 2014. And it went up in 2017 again to similar numbers.
After the ISIS attacks in Tehran.
Exactly. So what you have there is first, when ISIS first took Mosul and its anti-Shia ideology, suddenly you saw, and Iran's role in fighting ISIS, suddenly saw a lot of support for that. Once that started to die down, the attitude of the population was go home. Don't be involved in those things. Then Donald Trump comes, and he's hugging the Saudis more than anyone has ever hugged the Saudis. And ISIS hits Tehran for the first time and succeeds, and you suddenly see the attitude shifting again. Because then the argument of the government, it's better to fight ISIS there than to have them fight in Iran, starts to get some buy-in. And then I think we're back now in a situation precisely because of the economic situation, the lack of jobs, corruption, and everything else, in which you see the attitudes shifting back in opposition to what's going on. But I would say that at the same time, I don't see this being unique. I mean, how strong was the support in Turkey for Erdogan getting involved in Syria? Earlier on, it was very, very much against it. There was a strong sense of not wanting to be involved in these things. And the other thing that I think, to your question, will it change? I fear that it will not change for a very different reason. And that reason is, however much they're spending, it's probably one of the cheapest operations in the region compared to what others have spent. I mean, this is not the $1 trillion Iraqi invasion by the United States, nor is it the complete throwing of money of the Saudis onto whatever group, however close they may be to Al-Qaeda, doesn't matter, that the Saudis have been doing. This is a very different type of operation that, in comparison with these other things, is not at all as expensive. If the Iranians were to get serious and look at how they're misspending money, I suspect they will start elsewhere than to start on this issue.
Can I just add, since you mentioned Trita, the University of Maryland polling, they have just done another series of polls just this week in Iran, and we're going to present the findings on Friday, February 2nd at the Atlantic Council. They're going to come back, and it'll be very interesting to see. You know, these are polls taken after the protests, so it'll be very interesting to see what they reflect.
Thank you. And Kadir, yesterday Secretary Tillerson made a statement about, a speech actually, about Syria policy. And one of the 5 objectives in Syria, US policy in Syria, is Iranian influence in Syria. So considering that, and if we assume that this will be this time not a speech but a policy that will be implemented, so what do you think US and Turkey can find a common ground in Syria about Iran, or do you think Turkey will avoid taking that route and continue with the Astana process?
Well, I think it's not going to be easy because you have all this investment the U.S. has made on the PYD since September of 2014, and if they say, you know what, we are ready to drop it all and sit down and have a conversation about what policy we should design in Syria, I think that could work, but that won't happen. We all know that. That didn't happen under Obama either. So I think there's very little hope on the Turkish side about getting back to a cooperation with the U.S. on Syria. The cooperation with Russia and Iran was not necessarily a choice. It was basically necessity after the fall of Aleppo, especially. Now, can we get to a place basically can just put the pieces back together, or keep the country somehow intact and keep PYD's influence from getting larger? But that requires a vision about the regime, what needs to happen in 5 years down the road in Syria. The US has insisted on laser focused on ISIS, and now the support for PYD is being justified through potential for ISIS to come back, which is not, from the Turkish perspective especially, that's not really a serious prospect. So they're very confused and suspicious about the support for PYD. Many serious thinkers also say, okay, it's not a Kurdish state tomorrow that's going to emerge out of this. We recognize that. What is the U.S. trying to do? And when you argue that the U.S. does not really have a policy, there are very few buyers in Turkey. They're not buying it. They're suspicious. They just like they talked about confronting Iran, and then they let Iran have all this strategic gains in the region. This is the perspective, of course. I'm not talking about factually. It ended up being basically enabling Iran in the region, and they're confused about the U.S. policy. I don't think Tillerson's, if that turns into a policy, that they would need to address the issue of PYD. They would need to address the issue of the regime, what happens to Assad, and of course Israel's security for U.S. is always a priority that will play into the calculations as well. But it's very pessimistic, to be honest, in terms of U.S.-Turkey cooperation.
Thank you very much. And now I can open the floor for Q&A session. So if you have any question, please raise your hand. We have the microphone over here. Identify yourself, and if not, I can go on. So, and I'm warning that I'm.
Alex
Can I just add to something when we talk about the good questions are being developed? I understand there is a tendency to say that Iran has been the winner in the region and has done so well compared, say, to some of its rivals, the Saudis and so on. But I think it's really too early to start thinking along those lines. I mean, just think about it. What would Iran inherit if, and that's still a big if Iran becomes the top player in Syria? What will Iran inherit in Syria? Who's going to pay for the reconstruction of a Sunni majority country? Shia majority Iran? What kind of a commitment is that? How many decades does Iran have to be there? Where is the money going to come from? What about Iraq? I mean, Iraq in the short term might not be a challenge to the Islamic Republic, but in the long term, after Khamenei has departed, will there perhaps be an Iraqi Shia political model that's very different from the Iranian Shia political model, i.e. walking away from the supreme leadership as the idea, as the sort of paradise option that has been offered to us by the Islamic Republic since '79. See how popular Ayatollah Sistani, who's not political, is in Iraq, compare how despised Ayatollah Khamenei is in certain circles in Iran. Why is there such a big difference? Because Khamenei is not a cleric. He's a politician, and everyone knows that. I think there's a bigger question here that is brewing right now inside the Islamic Republic, because a lot of people are of the opinion that nobody's heard Shia Islam in Iran since Shia Islam became the state religion 500 years ago. Nobody's heard it as much as this present Islamic Republic in its 40 years in office. There are some fundamental questions that and we need answers for. That so I think it's a bit premature to say, well, they won, and they're going to be able to take care of everything from Yemen to Iraq to Syria. A lot could go wrong still.
Can I just? I mean, it's also a way to excuse. It's a way to excuse the failures of American leadership. You can just say, well, it's the Iranians, right? And throw your hands up.
One thing about this, Alex, you're right, but we don't know what the Iranian expectation, the government's expectation from these areas, right, from these countries. I don't think they expect these countries to thrive under Iranian leadership, but if they can be the deal makers and sort of look at Lebanon, right, without serious sort of Hezbollah Iranian approval, you can't do much, you can't change much. And they can come to the same kind of equilibrium in Syria and Iraq as well, and that would be good enough. They don't need to win in a way that these countries are sort of flourishing economically, etc.
Right.
So
Trita is getting impatient. So
I'm going to go one step further than Alex and actually say that, there's a reason why you can't say the Iranians are winning, because this is not a winning game. There's no one who's going to win in this. Whoever is going to take over Syria is going to be faced with a disaster. And in fact, the only way to win is not to enter these games in the first place. Just look at Turkey. Turkey pursued a policy of zero tensions with its neighbors, focused so much on the economy, it had so much soft power in the region, and for various reasons, it went into the geopolitical game, and it has suffered a tremendous amount of detriment as a result of that, as has the Iranians and everyone else. When we're talking about winning, it's that in such small relative terms, it's useless. The only way to be able to win is to end this game and find an exit out of it, because there's no winning inside the game itself.
Gentleman over here first.
Thank you. Gerald Chandler here. I'd like all of the panel to explore why the Iranian government would, and under what conditions the government would expand its nuclear activities. Right now, they're limited by the agreement, the JCPOA, and if Trump, as you've already remarked, continues along his program, he may or may not convince the Europeans to go along with him. But if he didn't, would that make and he kept doing what he's doing, why would the Iranian government expand its nuclear activities, or would it, and if it did expand its nuclear activities, would the Europeans react?
Trita.
So I think what their calculation has been so far, they've lived up to the agreements. The IAEA has certified that 9 times in a row now. And they're partly doing this to put themselves in the good guy category, as Trump is so adamant about putting himself in the bad guy category. But I think they thought they had more time. They thought that they can ride out this administration, they'll get trinkets of investments coming in, and everything will be calm. I think there has to be a realization now that they don't have as much time as they may have thought. And there is also a belief, I think, both in Europe and the United States, that, look, the Iranians are not going to do anything right now. And I think that's probably right now as a result of the Rouhani government being in power. But if this continues for another 3 certifications, in which he's creating all of this uncertainty about this, I think it is fair to expect that political dynamics in Iran will also start to change, particularly if they're seeing the Europeans not taking a firm stand against the United States. That's when I think the Iranians will start doing things, at first not violations of the deal, but they'll start increasing some of the research and things like that are not clear violations, but nevertheless would go against the spirit of the deal. But there's going to be there's going to be an index. They're not going to go from 0 to 10 right away, but they're probably going to start going. And that's going to partly be because internal dynamics in Iran is going to change, in which the belief that they have been screwed over by this deal is going to significantly increase over time if nothing changes positively. And at that point, voices who were against this deal inside Iran are going to get much more traction.
Just one other point, and Iranian officials have already raised this, that they would perhaps be a little less cooperative with inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency. So again, on a scale, right? Maybe take a little longer to visit this site or to explain this discrepancy, that sort of thing, but in a way that would not be, an egregious violation of the agreement.
Thank you.
Hello, Medea Benjamin. I had 2 questions. One related to the protests. What we saw of it was a lot of attacking of shops and cars and even police station. How much of that was actually happening? And if that was a lot, I think that might explain why a lot of women didn't come out. And on this broader issue of where do we go in the next 130 days, what happened to all the people under Obama in Congress, outside of Congress, who were lobbying so hard for the deal to go through? What are they and you all doing right now?
The first question, Alex. Let's.
Sure.
Take the second.
Okay.
I think the authorities in Tehran definitely wanted you to have the impression that these were a bunch of hooligans running amok in the city streets. And they did actually more than that, to shape the image not just of the international audience watching in, but also at home, the silent majority that I was speaking of. There are a couple of cases of the Iranian national flag being burned. We never really saw who these people were. But guess what the regime did? These people hate Iran. The ones who are in the streets are safe haters, Iran haters, and so on. So the Iranian regime very quickly, when it has to, puts aside his Islamist mantle and puts on a nationalist mantle to appeal to a bigger audience. So I think there's a lot of manipulation going on that front. But look, frankly, overall, my take was these are young, angry young people who feel like they have nothing in their lives, who are out in the streets, and the target were the militias, the besieged militia forces, the so-called police or the law enforcement forces. The Revolutionary Guards themselves did not want to come out because they don't want to have to dirty their hands. According to the head of the Revolutionary Guards, General Jafari, they only deployed to 3 provinces of Hamadan, Isfahan, and Lorestan, because the Revolutionary Guards didn't want to have to own this, because they knew about the optics, how it looks like to be sort of the ones that are doing physically the repression. So they'd rather have the nameless police officer do it than the guy in the uniform of the IRGC. But I want to go back to a point we've raised repeatedly from different angles today, which is the structural issues that are at the heart of this. This is, even if an ordinary shop was attacked, once you got people angry in the streets, things get out of control. But that doesn't explain the spontaneous reaction of so many people in 100 towns and cities rising up and saying, the way this country is going forward is just the wrong path. And I think that to me is the message. And I wonder if anybody in the pyramids of power, in the corridors of power, as I should say, in the Islamic Republic, are going to take the right lessons from this. Because as you've heard from, I think, all of us, this is just going to come back again in another form or shape. But unless they fix it, and it's not just economic, it's political. And this is a moment for Rouhani to man up. This is a moment for Rouhani to start looking to be his own man and stop being just a servant to Khamenei. Because Khamenei, when he gets his will never compromise. Khamenei has had 3 presidents, 4 presidents work under him. Rafsanjani, Khatami, Ahmadinejad, and Rouhani. Arguably, Rouhani is the one he controls the most. Right? Arguably, Rouhani is the one he controls the most. But that shouldn't stop Rouhani from trying to be his own man. He's 10 years younger than Khamenei, has a good shot of being the next Iranian supreme leader, but he has to, as I've said repeatedly, he has to stop being the politician who's constantly running as a candidate, promises things but never delivers. He has to actually start delivering. And as I said, it's not just the economic front, it has to be on political front, which is the trickiest part of it all.
On
The second question.
Yeah, Medea, on the effort. I mean, with Trump, of course, as you know better than anyone, this is a target-rich environment. So many groups are working on many issues, immigration, social justice, and so on. But the groups that worked on the deal back in 2015 that helped get it through Congress, we're all still in touch with each other. We still are organized. We're still working very hard, many of us, in conjunction, in the case of the Atlantic Council, we're working very much with the Europeans. We're also going up to Capitol Hill, and one of the encouraging things we've seen is that the Democrats, many of whom were quite lukewarm about the nuclear agreement in 2015, are now pretty much unanimous in support of it, and have made it clear that they are not going to allow changes that would violate the terms of the deal or that the Europeans are not on board with. So we do see some positive signs from our efforts, and we are very much continuing those efforts.
Could I add a couple of things on both questions? I actually asked a very similar question to an organizer of the Green Movement in Iran before they closed down, Telegram. And he mentioned something that was interesting, which is at the end that we have to remember the Green Movement, perhaps we've been so used to it, so we think that that's the only protest in Iran, was an organized and relatively disciplined movement. He said that, how they had trained to make sure that they had a critical mass of people on the streets in 2009. If some people started to use violence, whether that was, attacking a shop or anything like that, or even against the police, there were others within the demonstrations trained to diffuse the situation and retain the nonviolent discipline. And that's part of the reason there were so many images of Green protesters protecting police in 2009, because they kept that nonviolent discipline. This was a leaderless movement coming out of sheer frustration, legitimate frustration. Didn't have leadership, didn't have training, didn't have any of these things. So, and as has been pointed out, a lot of them very young men. And as a result, perhaps it's to be expected that it's not going to be able to keep the same type of discipline as a political movement such as the Green Movement could maintain at the time. That's one point. On the issue of what's going on right now, I think I agree 100% with what Barbara said. There's still a lot of different things going on, and there's positives and negatives. The positive is, frankly, in some ways, this is a much stronger discipline amongst the Democrats in favor of the deal than existed before. And there's many reasons for it, one being, of course, that as more people have realized that the main reason, perhaps, that Trump is doing this is because he just hates everything Obama is doing. For you as a Democrat to support Trump destroying what part of Obama's legacy just adds one other political reason why it would be difficult for a Democrat to come out and support. But there's also real policy reasons, which is there is an understanding that after this, if this causes the collapse of the deal, we're in a worse situation than we were in 2012 and 2013. At least then you could say, well, diplomacy has not been tried. Diplomacy has not been exhausted. Post this, the path back to diplomacy is much, much more difficult. And as a result, the escalatory risks are far greater. And particularly when Trump is sending the issue to Congress, he's essentially wanting to make sure that Congress has its fingerprints on the disaster so that they will also be blamed or at least share the blame for that disaster. In a way, it was similar to the 2002 vote giving George W. Bush authority to use war. It's a vote that was very costly politically and had huge political ramifications beyond what people understood at the time. This time around, they understand it. So that's held them back. But on the other hand, I would say there's a negative. And the negative is that there's been so much focus on making sure that there's no sanctions being passed in Congress that would directly violate the deal. There's so much pressure on Trump not just straight out kill the deal. Very little focus on how he's actually killing the deal without directly killing the deal. And that's going to be the main challenge going forward.
Thank you. We have one last question, or let me get the questions together. Collect the questions.
In the past few years, we've seen greater involvement of Russia in the Syrian conflict with its own outcomes. Do you think the destabilization or the protest in Iran will have their own reflection on the Russia-Iranian cooperation? They've been cooperating before in the nuclear field. Do you think there's a risk or potential for the Russian-Iranian cooperation? Or
That is an excellent question, and I would suggest you come to an event that we're holding tomorrow morning at the Atlantic Council starting at 9 o'clock. It's called Iran Looks East, and we're going to focus on Iran's trade relationships with Asia and its strategic relationship with Russia. That's the second panel, and we have a very bright young man coming from Moscow to talk about that. So please come tomorrow and ask that question.
But can I just try and
With the
answer?
contribution of viewers like you. So.
You're not from Russia, but go ahead.
I'm not Russian, but
Let me collect
okay,
another
sure.
question, and because this will be the last. The questions over here, Jackson. Russia is kind of elephant in the room. In each and every panel, I'm the person who reminds, like, how about Russia? Because everybody is talking about Saudi involvement, US involvement, Turkish involvement, but somehow Russia always achieved to make itself disappear from the panels. Yes.
Vincenzo Faso. I just want to ask two brief questions. I think the first question is, do you think that a problem with the Trump administration is going to be putting the protests and the nuclear deal into the same category as a way to kill the deal? And my second question is, I guess with what kind of tools do younger people have in Iran, especially in a region that has a very high youth population? Look at Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE. And it seems like to me, as a person that's also following the protests, it seems like it's a mixture of things going on. Economic grievances, foreign policy grievances. I mean, you've heard people saying, pull out of Syria, think about us, or that was a chant that I heard following it. So, what kind of tools do young people have? It seems like they're very well educated, science, technology, and won't go any further. So,
thanks. Michael, also thank you guys for coming. I don't think that, but thank you guys for coming.
I will say at the end.
Okay.
Don't steal my time.
So my question is regarding Saudi Arabia, and I know that there have been more and more like kind of polarization between Saudi Arabia and Iran, kind of like the Shia crescent forming and all of that. And I was kind of wondering what you think might happen in the future, especially like with Trump siding with the Sunnis against the Shias and kind of like demonizing them, and Saudi Arabia taking a closer stance with Israel and all of that. So what do you guys think might happen in regards to that in the future? Like, might there be a regional war, like two big wars, or?
So let's start the last tour. Everybody has 2 minutes because
Oh, 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I mean, very quickly
Pick
on
your
the,
question.
on the Saudi issue, I think certainly the United States should stay out of the business of picking Shia sides versus Sunni side or anything like that. I mean, that's just an un-American thing to do, and I think the U.S. ought to stay out of it. I think the Saudis, I wish them all the best of luck with the reforms, but this is a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of open questions here about whether Saudi Arabia can pull it off, because it's not just what they're doing in the region. Some fundamental changes are coming through inside Saudi Arabia. So that again, time will show. But I also think it would be an exaggeration to talk about the Sunni camp. I mean, just look at Turkish relations with the Gulf states right now. A lot of tension between Turkey, UAE, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. Turkey is now moving towards Jordan because of some of those tensions. So, I mean, to simplify the region into Sunni and Shia will not help anyone analyze what's going on. My point about Russia is I just wanted to sort of throw it out there in a bigger context. Back in 2005, when I was last in Iran to cover the elections, when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad became president, he famously, in terms of foreign policy, basically said things like, we don't need the West. The West, these are the demographic aging group of people that soon will not matter any longer. Right? He came up with the concept of look south and east, hence his many trips to Africa, to butting up to people like Hugo Chavez in Latin America. And some stronger ties with East Asia, which made China the great trading partner that Iran is. I mean, remember, 20 years ago, Germany used to be Iran's biggest trading partner. China now has 1/3 of Iran's overall trade. That's all started under Ahmadinejad. And that might all be good. But what the Iranian officials have learned in the process is you can't compensate for the West. Not anytime soon anyway. And that includes the United States and that includes the Europeans. I think that's the lesson Rouhani learned. So the West and the United States, as difficult as these relations are, need to be part of that Iranian discussion. To close your eyes and say, Russia will take care of me at the UN Security Council, or China will take care of me, it's not going to happen. The Iranians have learned this, and for good reasons. Russia has its own interest to pursue. Russia doesn't just have one foreign policy centered on Iran. Russia has multiple interests that they can talk to the Americans about. And the Chinese, the same story goes for the Chinese and others. So what I'm saying is any healthy foreign policy debate in Iran has to recognize that, cheap headlines like look south and east, ignore the West, they're getting old, that's the declining empire, that's not helpful. A final point about Russia, you will see more tensions between Iran and Russia as things develop in Syria, because now, once the war is coming to an end, that's when the real fight between, or the competition for influence between Iran, Russia, and others will increase. But overall, Russia is an immediate neighbor of Iran, one of the 15 immediate neighbors. They don't barely trade with one another, about $2 billion. That's nothing. That's nothing for a country the size of Russia with Iran. So there's a lot they can do together on the economic front, but we shouldn't assume that they're hand in hand on the geopolitics of what's going on in the region. There's, they're pursuing different paths.
Kadir?
I just, you reminded me of a conversation in 2012 when we were discussing what to do about Syria. One friend said, we just don't want to go in there. We just don't care about what's happening, and we don't want to be there. So now, 6 years almost later, now the U.S. is talking about building a, let's say, 30,000 strong army, etc. I think the U.S. will always be in the region. It's not always, let's say, but it will be there. It's been there for a long time. It will be there. It's right now in Iraq. It's in Syria. It's in Lebanon. It's in but what's different these days, especially under the Trump administration, actually we can say that last years of Obama was like that as well. We are missing this kind of U.S. leadership, willingness to lead and provide some sort of comprehensive framework so that regional actors can position themselves. But I think the interesting thing is regional powers no longer expect that. It's not a matter of whether they want it or not. They realize, I think they recognize that that's not going to happen. And we see them adjusting among themselves. Russia fills in some, vacuum in some place, but nobody is assuming this kind of broader regional role. And that's not going to happen. And I think regional actors are aware of this. When we look at the Gulf, their gambit in Lebanon, right? It wasn't that U.S. came in and you can't do this, and then they backed off. Lebanese came out and said, he's still our prime minister. With Qatar, right? It wasn't the U.S. who came in and said, we have all these, you can't do it. Yes, they did underline their interests, the U.S. Military base in Qatar, but it was actually the regional powers, Turkey, Iran, their pushback made that gambit fail as well. Again, KRG. So many of these issues we are discussing in the region, the U.S. will be there, and the U.S. will have certain priorities, often misplaced or whatever, but the U.S. is no longer willing to do the sort of heavy lifting in terms of diplomatic leadership, and that's doing that even in the case of nuclear deal, which Obama administration spent so many years. So and that's a fact in the region. I think it's already bought. And that's not going to change tomorrow or a year down the road. I think that's the reality of the region now.
Mm-hmm. I would just agree completely with what Kadir said. I think when I see the State Department fully staffed with people in important positions that have been confirmed in those positions, when I see, a real interagency process that comes up with some real diplomatic formulas, then maybe I'll change my mind. CNN did a poll, results just came out, and it shows that the view of U.S. in the world has dropped by about 20 points since Trump came in. In terms of U.S. leadership, now only 30% of people in the world see the U.S. as a leader. Used to be, much higher. And China now is seen as a leader in the world by a larger percentage of people than the United States is. So, this is where we are.
Trita?
Yeah, a chant at the State Department might be, forget
The
about
mood
Syria,
gets down and
think
down.
about us. But on a couple of points, I want to go into your questions on Saudi Arabia. I think what this comes down to is that you had a major shift in the balance in the region after 2003 and a major change in the order. The United States was the guarantor of security for many of the allies of the U.S. in the region up until 2003, particularly Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And from the Saudi perspective, I can definitely understand why they're so upset at the U.S. because the invasion of Iraq, which they strongly advised against, ended up playing out pretty much the way they expected, that this would actually unleash Iranian power and Iran would become much more successful. And this is what has happened. Now, they thought, and they fought for quite some time to try to find a way to get the United States to reverse the balance of power so that the pre-2003 balance could be resurrected. And the Obama administration was not interested. They didn't believe that it was possible. They didn't believe that they had the resources. And they also didn't believe that it would be sustainable anyway, because that balance was nevertheless not indigenous. It was based on America upholding it. It did not have any indigenous legs. And instead, they moved to do this nuclear deal with Iran. And one byproduct of that nuclear deal is that it ended 3 decades of American policy of containing and isolating Iran, essentially accepting that Iran is a major power in the region and that it has interests that will be taken into account. I think the Saudis were starting to recognize that this is the new reality. They didn't like it, they hated it. And then they got essentially an unexpected lifeline, and that is a Trump administration that beyond it not understanding geopolitics, you have now the opportunity that these countries has never had before, despite the fact that they've been influential in this city, to completely bypass the interagency process. As long as you have Jared Kushner's cell phone, you can get, and you can make sure that Trump issues a tweet, and then Tillerson has to figure out how he's going to make policy out of that tweet. So you have an ability to be able to influence the United States in a way that simply didn't exist before. And I think that's very tempting in Riyadh, because it tells them, why should Saudi Arabia come to the negotiating table with Iran at a time when clearly the Saudis are in a weaker position because of Yemen, because of Syria, because of Lebanon, because of Iraq? Why should they do that if there actually is an opportunity to convince the United States to go back to its old policy and essentially fight Saudis' battles for it? And I think that's part of the reason why the Saudis are resisting, because they have that hope. Perhaps that hope will come true, perhaps it will not. I don't see them having a plan B, though.
Thank you very much. I want to thank for our panelists and for you for coming to the panel. And please join me to thank our panelists.
Thank you.